Welcome to the 15th video in this series, The Dictatorship of the Proletariat according to Marx and Engels. Today we'll be going over the 1880 piece by Engels, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Part 3, Historical Materialism. I've subtitled this, Revolutionary Transformation Creates Conscious Social Self-Organization. In this section of Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Engels shows how the dictatorship of the proletariat's necessity comes from the material and social necessities demonstrated through the historical development of class. The social structure of any given society is fundamentally emergent from the processes of the material reproduction of the totality of life activity of human society, which is in turn the determinant of how distribution of the product of material production occurs. Since distribution is dependent on what is produced, how it is produced, and the method by which products are exchanged, in order to fully transcend the social division of labor, which is the material basis of classes, production needs to be such that society is able to fully support everyone in it. Philosophies, ethics, conceptions of justice, and other such ideas are shaped by the material conditions of production and exchange, and as contradictions arise, new ideas emerge that are themselves insufficient to create change because the material force of the state, which serves the interests of the ruling class of a given era, maintains the prevailing relations of production through special force. Therefore, the state must be overcome to achieve fundamental transformation, which will only occur through the revolutionizing of the mode of production and exchange. What comes next, in turn, is a transitory period which constructs a new mode of production, both the forces and relations that make that up. With the development of socialized production carrying out upon highly technical forces of production with a division of labor, the forces of production became socialized within the Industrial Revolution, and with this, the preconditions for the new mode of production arose, with the relations of production emergent from this producing the class, which has no material interest to carry out the construction of this new mode of production, the proletariat. This class, made up of those who own no means of production and must sell their labor to the owners of capital in exchange for wages, is continually growing in number and becoming immiserated and materially precarious, thus producing the will and capacity for the vast majority of society to enter into common struggle with the intent of completely bringing an end to private accumulation through ownership of the means of production. Thus, the material basis for the overthrow of capitalism and the social group to carry it out that overthrow have been established. The seeds for the next mode of production's relations themselves are shown through the contradictions of capitalism, which draws capital to invalidate its own role in bourgeois production more and more, including the role of capitalists themselves as individuals. Production is centralized and carried out through plans. Individual capitalists become incapable of competing, instead finding themselves having to transform their enterprises into joint stock companies. The state takes on a continually greater role in production and distribution, and trusts, wherein individual capitalists are no longer able to run their own businesses due to sheer size, instead placed in trust to a trustee. The forces of production are continually socialized, but in a capitalist manner, to the ends of creating more private accumulation. The key contradiction that is socialized production, where the means of production labor done upon them is more and more socialized, while they are at the same time subject to a mode of appropriation which presupposes the private production of individuals with private accumulation, increases in distinction continually, resulting in more violent upheavals. This contradiction sits at the center of capital and founds the basis of all other contradictions within it, if in different forms, such as 1. The resulting relation between the proletarian and bourgeois classes. 2. The social form of commodity exchange, wherein everyone owns their own product and brings it to the market as an individual, despite the social nature of production. 3. The anarchy of production in society in general with competition, which is in contrast to organized large-scale industrial production, which is progressively more necessary. Production becomes so complex and developed that the anarchy of production becomes a fetter on capitalist development. 4. The mode of production comes into contradiction with the mode of exchange, shown in general crisis, which acts as a period of violent disturbance which revolutionizes capital and fetters it in the same moment. This would be, for example, the Great Depression. Crises of overproduction. Continuing, despite these contradictions coming to a head and forcing capital to take on greater socialized forms and be taken out of the hands of the capitalist class, and ceding increasingly more in the face of its development, the forces of production remain fully capitalistic. Quote, "The capitalist relation is not done away with. It is, rather, brought to a head. But brought to a head, it topples over. State ownership of the productive forces is not the solution of the conflict, but concealed within it are the technical conditions that form the elements of that solution." End quote. Thus, we see the potential through the acts the capitalists have to carry out in order to keep up with the development of the productive forces of the new mode of production. With the proletariat seizing power, the real recognition of the social nature of modern production will become fully evident. The proletariat's social power will result in them bringing the forces and relations of production in line with one another, thereby resolving the contradictions between socialized production and private appropriation through the abolition of the latter. The process of this abolition will not be immediate and carried out universally across the board at the same rate. Rather, it will be done over time, bringing the productive forces into the whole society in the form of social control by direct and participatory organs from industries which have outgrown individual or small group control. We'll talk about the particularities of this in the PowerPoint series. The dictatorship of the proletariat will utilize a planned economy, making determinations directly and socially via the producers themselves, who understand the production process and products in full. The anarchy of production comes to an end, and rational and efficient allocation of resources for satisfaction of social needs becomes possible. This in turn makes the abolition of the social division of labor possible. Thus, all preconditions for a social revolution exist, and the class to carry it out as bearers of the material basis for revolution both exists and constantly grow through capital's expansion. The proletariat, which is increasingly pauperized and alienated within the capitalist mode of production, has no choice but to revolutionize the existing social and economic order. And by the way, I just want to say that pauperization is not only a direct material thing, right? Increasingly economically distraught people, but it's also a relative thing. Consider the vast growth in the wealth of billionaires. We might see trillionaires within the next couple of years, whereas it doesn't matter how long you work, right? There's no circumstance wherein any individual could ever work enough to reach that sort of wealth. The disparity is so monumental, it is crazy. Continuing, capitalism lays the groundwork for its own sublation. All that is needed now is for the proletariat to establish their own special coercive force after smashing the bourgeois one, that is to say the state, to carry out the real socialization of the productive forces and bring them under new relations which will produce a mode of production in line with their material interests. This will need to be carried out through the social revolution. This social revolution will create the basis for the complete societal change so desperately called for, but in material reality, which creates changes in philosophies, social organization, understanding of justice, conceptions of truth, ideas, and so on. In addition, through the seizure of state power and the transformation of the relations of production by the proletariat into fully socialized production without private accumulation, the proletariat both abolishes itself as a class and the state, as we currently understand it. In the dictatorship of the proletariat, the quote-unquote state becomes the real representatives of society, enabling self-governance and rendering the state's repressive role superfluous. This is because there's no longer any need for a special repressive force to maintain class rule, forced redistribution to maintain one section of the population at the cost of another, and so on. It is at this point that the commonality emerges. As the means of production are socialized through the state, society absorbs social power previously invested in it, and in this act, the state begins the process of withering away, with a government of persons being replaced by social management of resources, infrastructure, and systems that provide for society's needs. This marks the end of power and authority over people and the beginning of direct and rational economic planning carried out by the general intellect of society. This withering away, as the word suggests, occurs over time as social power is reabsorbed by society in sometimes great leaps and other times slowly and steadily as the productive forces develop in different industries. The next condition that the dictatorship must deal with is a division of labor, as that is what is the material basis for the existence of classes. The division of labor eventually creates the conditions for a state in order to maintain the ruling class's position through violent force. Ergo, until the division of labor is abolished, the state cannot be in full transcended. The social division of labor itself results from production being insufficient to support the whole of society. The dictatorship of the proletariat must be maintained until the productive forces are completely developed with the socialization of production, creating both the social and material basis for the complete abolition of the division of labor and resulting conditions for class distinctions. This abolition also requires the elimination of political domination, cultural monopolization, and intellectual leadership by a particular class over other classes, which begins to hinder societal development. And to be clear here, I would argue that this is a misreading by Engels, because based on our reading of the critique of the Gotha program and the character of the communist mode of production, clearly the forces of production are developing even, once the lower phase of communist society has been established and the state has withered away, and we are in the period of the Gemeinwesen, right? It's not until those three different things, the end of the division of labor becoming life's prime want as all alienation ceases, and the productive forces in all individuals have reached high development for cooperative wealth being made fully accessible, that the higher stage of communism is completely established, right? So I think that what is more meant here is that the dictatorship of the proletariat must be maintained until a certain point wherein the productive forces allow for essentially the transition of all petty production with complete socialization of production, which in turn will result in the end of any sort of private ownership of the means of production, either by small groups of people or by individuals, because there will be what amounts to petty bourgeois. We'll talk about this more within the transition of the economic self-governance, right, in the PowerPoint series, but there will be a steady transition here. And then at that point, we have the development of the commonality in full. From there, the productive forces under the control of the whole society continue developing until the point wherein there's a quantitative change resulting into a qualitative change, the higher phase of communism. Continuing. Thus, the final defeat of the division of labor is a historical, material basis for the full development of the communist mode of production, carried out within the dictatorship of the proletariat through the seizure of the productive forces and their development to increasing total production with minimal labor time and divisions between industries, implementation of social planning, and social development towards an end of the separation of mental and physical labor through the development of well-rounded individuals. With this, people's struggle for basic necessities comes to an end, and people can engage in labor according to their personal desires. At this point, humanity is no longer ruled by forces outside of us, but only by our own will through our own mastery of our own social organization. There is a conscious control over social development, allowing the proletariat to actively work towards a true human community by creating a society which fits our social desires, operating within the limitations of the forces of production. The self-governance of the proletariat through its direct and participatory organs, most nobly the commune and councils, therefore creates a new social conditions of liberation, wherein mankind makes its own history consciously rather than being subjects of history. This liberation is not immediate, but grows over time. In short, in the proletarian revolution, the proletariat transforms the socialized means of production into public property through the seizure of public power. This conversion of the productive forces into public property results in the fetters on their development created by individual ownership coming to an end. The forces of production take on a highly socialized form and increase in productivity. From this, a planned economy emerges, and the distinctions between industries diminish, which leads to an end of the social division of labor as the productive forces develop. At this point, The state becomes superfluous as all of society self-organizes and political authority becomes impossible to establish itself. And that is my summary of what Engels' 1880 piece, Socialism, Utopian and Scientific, Part 3, Historical Materialism, has to say about the dictatorship of the proletariat. As usual, if you'd like to see the quotations I derived the summary from, feel free to go into the description below. There is a link to the Google Doc, and also there's a link to the United Marxist Pact Discord server, wherein if you'd like to discuss this or any other piece in greater detail, we would love to have you there. Tomorrow we will be going over the last piece in this series, the 1884 piece, Engels, Origin of the Family, Private Property and the State, Part 9, Barbarism and Civilization. Thank you for joining me for today's topical summary, and I hope to see you tomorrow.